Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to have you back for another story here on Fogman Stories, a channel dedicated to sharing true Catholic spiritual encounters from around the world. Today, I'd like to take you to a small, quiet village nestled somewhere in the European countryside. There, standing silently through the centuries, is an old church wrapped in mystery and whispered prayers. Locals speak of a mysterious gatekeeper, an old man carrying a lantern who appears only at night. He doesn't say much, but always seems to show up when someone is lost or in need of help near the church gate. The strange thing is, no one knows who he is, and no one has ever seen him in daylight. This story follows the journey of a young woman named Elena, who not only saw him with her own eyes, but stayed behind to uncover the truth behind this silent guardian. And now, let us step into the mystery together. Chapter 1. The Man at the Gate. They say the wind carries whispers in our little town, quiet voices that skim along the cobblestones and curl through the wrought iron fences of St. Evelyn's Church. You wouldn't hear them unless you walked alone, late into the night, when the moon hovers low and everything else folds into stillness. That's when the stories begin to stir. I wasn't born here, but after living among these hills for almost a decade, I've come to believe that there are places where the veil is thinner, where the spiritual doesn't just exist in stories or Sunday Mass, but breathes in the fog, moves in the shadows, and stands at the gate. St. Evelyn's sits at the end of a narrow road, just past the last bakery and a crumbling stone bridge. Built in 1762, the church has weathered wars, storms, and a fire that took half its roof in 1911. Its steeple rises like a worn finger into the sky, wrapped in ivy, its bell rusted but still echoing faintly on feast days. And just beyond its cast iron gates, there's a space where something or someone waits. The first time I heard about the gatekeeper, I was sitting with old Bernadette at the cafe that overlooks the churchyard. She leaned in, breath smelling faintly of licorice and red wine, and said, "You've not yet met the man at the gate, have you?" "You mean the sacristan?" I asked, thinking of Father Lucian's assistant. She shook her head slowly. "No, not that one. I mean the old man in the gray cloak, with the lantern." I laughed, softly. "A statue?" "No statue. He moves. He appears when you need him. Only at night. He's helped more people than you'd believe, and nobody knows his name." I chalked it up to small-town folklore, but as the days passed, I kept hearing fragments of the same story, from the florist who once broke down outside the church in the snow, from the retired teacher who claimed a man had guided her home after she fell on the cobblestones, and from a teenager who said the man kept her company one evening when she waited for her mother. All of them described him the same way: tall, cloaked in gray, lantern in hand, silent except for a kind smile. Curious, I asked Father Lucian one morning after Mass, "Is there someone who watches over the gate at night? Maybe a volunteer?" He looked up from his rosary, brows furrowed. "There hasn't been a night watchman here since the war, and I've never asked anyone to stand at the gate." "Why do you ask?" I hesitated. "Just something I keep hearing." He chuckled lightly. "Old stories, but if someone is there, perhaps it is an angel. The gate itself is nothing special, ornate. Yes, with swirls of iron and a crest shaped like a flaming heart. But its lock is broken. It swings open with a creak when the wind is strong enough. On most nights, it stands ajar, like an invitation. I passed it dozens of times without seeing anything, until one foggy Tuesday night. I'd gone to visit a sick friend on the other side of town and decided to walk back. Even though the streets were nearly empty, as I approached the church, I noticed a soft glow ahead. At first I thought it was a street lamp, but the town's lamps are electric, pale white, and this light was warm, flickering like fire. And then I saw him. He stood still as stone. Just beyond the gate, his cloak was heavy, draped over his shoulders, and he held a brass lantern that swayed slightly in the breeze. His face was half-shadowed, but I could make out his eyes, clear and gentle, and a faint smile that felt strangely familiar. I stopped in my tracks. I didn't say a word. He raised his hand slowly and pointed, not at me, but at the church door. Then he bowed his head slightly, like someone finishing a prayer, and turned away. I blinked. He was gone. No footsteps, no rustle of fabric, just the lantern light still glowing on the ground for a moment before fading into the mist. I told no one, not at first, but then it happened again, and not just to me. An elderly man collapsed from heart trouble just outside the gates weeks later. A woman said she saw the gatekeeper rush to his side, lay a hand on his shoulder, and whisper something she couldn't hear. When she blinked, he was gone, but the ambulance came faster than anyone expected. Another time, a young boy ran away from home during a storm. He claimed a man with a lantern guided him back to the church steps, where his mother was already waiting, sobbing. The boy didn't know how to describe the man, only that he felt safe. What struck me most was this: no one had seen him during the day. Not once. Father Lucian had begun to humor the stories, even blessing the gate with holy water each Sunday after hearing of another strange encounter. And then came Elena, a traveler from Spain. She arrived in our town one late autumn evening, backpack slung over her shoulder, eyes wide with wonder. She'd missed the last bus and wandered the narrow streets alone. When she reached the church, the fog had settled thick, and the path ahead seemed uncertain. She later told me she'd been unsure which direction to go. Her map was soaked, her phone dead. Then she saw the light. The man in the cloak stood by the gate, just like in all the other stories. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his lantern and pointed to the left. There, at the bottom of the hill, was a small guest house, one Elena hadn't noticed before. She thanked him quietly, but he'd already turned away. The next morning, she woke early and asked the innkeeper about the place. The woman, eyes wide, told her the building used to be the home of a priest, a martyr from the 1940s, who had taken in war refugees and once kept a vigil for 7 days straight, praying for the safety of others. Elena asked if there was an old man who lived nearby. The woman only smiled and said, "Ah, you saw him. Too. I believe there are places guarded not by locks, but by presence, and sometimes that presence wears a cloak, holds a lantern, and waits for night to fall. The man at the gate is still there, waiting for someone who might need a light in the dark." Chapter 2. Stories whispers on the pew. The morning after my arrival in that fog-kissed village, I returned to St. Aveline's with one purpose: to find the old man I'd seen the night before. I didn't know what I would say to him, only that I needed to thank him. But as I stood before the black iron gates, now wide open and clinging with dew, I found no sign of the cloaked figure, only silence and the faint scent of incense trailing from the church's open doors. I stepped inside, wooden pews stretched in solemn rows under vaulted ceilings of pale stone. Candles flickered at the foot of the altar, casting soft halos of light. The place felt timeless, as though the air itself had memorized every prayer spoken within these walls. I wasn't sure why, but I sat. The pew creaked under my weight, a quiet sound in the stillness. I bowed my head, unsure what to pray for. Gratitude, yes, but also clarity. Who was he, and why did his presence feel so otherworldly? When I rose to leave, I noticed a woman kneeling near the front, elderly, with silver hair tucked into a dark blue shawl. I waited until she stood, and then gently approached. "Excuse me," I began softly. "I was here last night, and I think someone helped me find my way." An older man, gray cloak, lantern. "Do you know him?" Her eyes met mine with something between recognition and wonder. She smiled. "You've seen him, too?" That was the first thread of the tapestry. Her name was Margot, and over tea later that morning, she told me her own story. One Christmas Eve, many years ago, her granddaughter had wandered off during midnight mass. The whole family had searched the snowy streets in panic. It was the old man who brought the child back, hand in hand. Through the falling snow, lantern glowing faintly against the storm. He didn't speak, she said, just smiled. Warmest smile I've ever seen. I took out my notebook. As the hours passed, I spoke to more people. Most didn't need prompting. They shared their stories like confessions, reverent and hushed. A homeless man told me he was given a loaf of bread near the church steps one night. Still warm, no one saw who gave it. A florist remembered her delivery van stalling in the dark, and the man with the lantern tapping gently on her window, pointing toward a side road that led to a nearby mechanic. When she turned to thank him, he was gone. Again and again, I heard the same elements: nightfall, a quiet need, a sudden appearance, no conversation, just direction, help offered without condition, then disappearance. I began to wonder if this was more than kindness, more than coincidence. Curious, I sought out Father Lucian again. He welcomed me into the rectory with a steaming cup of chicory and a wry smile. "You've been busy, Miss Elena." "I have," I admitted. "I keep hearing about this man. Everyone's seen him, but no one seems to know who he is." The priest sat quietly for a moment, staring into his cup. "I've never caught him in the daylight," he said finally, "but I believe he exists. Or something exists. Have you checked the security footage?" I asked. He nodded. "We have a small camera above the entrance. It records motion, but every time someone says he appeared, there's nothing. The screen is blank, as if the system went still during those moments." The hair on my arms rose. "What about the police?" "They've investigated, lightly. There's been no harm done. No crimes committed, just stories." He paused. "But you'd be surprised how many officers have a story of their own. I left the rectory with my thoughts tangled. What was I chasing? A ghost? An angel? Some elderly Samaritan with a gift for vanishing? But I couldn't stop. By the week's end, I had 10 stories in my notebook. Some recent, others decades old. The details changed, names, streets, weather, but the presence was always the same. The gray cloak, the lantern, the silence. I took long walks at night, tracing the edges of the church grounds, hoping to glimpse him again, but he never appeared, at least, not to me. Still, I sensed him. There were nights when the breeze shifted suddenly, carrying the faint scent of smoke and old wood. Sometimes, I'd see a glow from the corner of my eye, soft, golden, but when I turned, it was gone. I started staying for morning mass, sitting in the pews where so many had prayed before me. The wood was worn, polished by decades of folded hands and whispered hopes. And as I sat there, I began to feel something else, stories lingering, like dust motes in sunlight. One morning, a child sat beside me. Her name was Isabel. She was no older than 8. Hair in braids, rosary clutched tightly. Her grandmother was in confession, and she looked up at me shyly. "You're the writer," she said. "I suppose I am. I saw him once, on Christmas." "You did?" She nodded. "He held my hand when I got scared. I think he prays a lot." I smiled. "Do you think he lives here?" She looked up at the stained glass window. "No, I think he lives with God. But sometimes, God lets him visit, out of the mouths of children." That night, I wrote by candlelight, pages filled with accounts, drawings, questions. I was no longer just collecting stories. I was becoming part of one. Something holy lingered in that church. I could feel it in the creak of the pews, in the candle flames that never quite went out, in the way strangers spoke of the gatekeeper with reverence. I didn't know what I'd find, but I knew this. I had to stay, not for the article, not even for the book, but because something sacred had stirred inside me, and I wasn't ready to walk away. Chapter 3. The gate never locked. I had taken up lodging in a former convent-turned-guest house, a quiet place perched on the hill just above St. Aveline's. The rooms still smelled faintly of wax and lavender. The wooden floors creaked with the memory of sisters who once glided silently between prayers. I had no idea how long I would stay, but every morning I awoke to the same intention: to wait. I wrote during the day, edited photographs, transcribed interviews. I wandered the village, recorded the pealing of church bells, the whisper of wind through trees. But my real work began at dusk, when the town folded itself inward and night unveiled its hidden face. I often sat by the window of my small room, notebook in hand, watching the gate below. It never closed, not fully. Sometimes it swayed slightly in the wind, a gentle metal sigh, and always, it faced the church like an open question, like a gesture of invitation. I waited for him. I waited long enough that I began to wonder if I'd imagined him altogether. Then came the rain. It was a Thursday night, the kind of rain that feels like it's falling sideways, sharp, persistent, unrelenting. I had just extinguished my candle and was preparing to sleep when I caught movement at the edge of my vision. A flicker, a pulse of gold. I rushed to the window. There, Beneath the gate, half shielded by the downpour, stood a figure, cloaked, still. The lantern glowed steadily, casting light onto the slick cobblestones. I barely remembered to grab my coat before bolting down the stairs and into the storm. But by the time I reached the gate, the figure was gone. No footsteps, no sound, only the rain and the lantern. It had been left behind, perched on the stone wall beside the gate, flame unshaken by the wind. I picked it up. It was warm. Inside the glass, the wick flickered like breath. I held it for a long time, unsure what to make of the gesture. Was it meant for me, or had I simply interrupted something I was never meant to see? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window until the flame died out. In the days that followed, the stories returned, not from me, but from others. A truck driver had broken down just outside the village. Cold, frustrated, lost. He claimed an old man tapped on his window, gestured toward a side road, and disappeared before he could offer thanks. That side road led directly to the mechanic's house, who was kind enough to help despite the hour. Another tale came from a woman named Marianne, a former nurse turned catechist. She hadn't told her story in years, not since it happened over a decade ago. She had been standing by the cliffs one night, weeping, hopeless, ready to disappear into the sea. But someone approached her quietly, stood beside her in silence. He didn't stop her, he didn't say anything, but after a moment, he lit a lantern. She turned toward him. He only nodded, as if to say, "There is still light." She walked away that night. She became a teacher of faith soon after. When she told me this story, her voice trembled. "I don't think he saved me," she said. "I think he reminded me I wasn't alone." These stories came like waves, subtle, quiet, never overwhelming, but always arriving, like the sea itself had decided to speak through the lives of villagers. And each wave carried the echo of a flame, a cloak, a gaze too kind to forget. And yet, no one had ever truly spoken to him. Neither had I. Sometimes I thought perhaps I didn't want to. To speak would be to ground him in something mortal. And he didn't feel mortal. He felt ancient, beyond time, or perhaps suspended in a moment where time and eternity meet. Still, my journal filled. I found myself sketching more often his silhouette, the way the lantern light cast long shadows against stone. I recorded candlelight in photographs, hoping it might mimic that golden hue I'd seen. But it never did. His light was different, not fire, not electricity. It was presence. One evening, I walked the church grounds with Father Lucian. "You seem absorbed," he said gently. "I am. Not frightened." "No," I said, "not at all. If anything, I feel watched over." He nodded, hands clasped behind his back. "You're not the first to say that." We stopped at the gate. It creaked slightly in the breeze, though the night was still. "Why never lock it?" I asked. He smiled. "Because the church is never closed to those who are seeking, and because some visitors come when no one else is watching." That night, I left the lantern on my windowsill, a small offering. The next morning, it was gone. No one in the guest house had seen it. The window had remained closed, but the lantern had vanished, and in its place was a folded note. No ink, no handwriting, just the impression of words, as though they had been whispered into the parchment. The light returns where it is needed. I clutched the paper to my chest. Whatever he was, he had noticed me, and I knew, without question, that I was being invited deeper. Not just into mystery, but into faith, into something older than the village, older than the church, a silent order of guardians, perhaps, or simply one soul who refused to leave his post. Some evenings, I would walk barefoot to the gate, just to be near it, just to listen. The iron would hum faintly beneath my fingers, as if holding memories too vast for words. The gate never locked, because he was always there, even when we could not see him. Chapter 4. Candles and Footsteps. There are nights when silence speaks, not through voices, but through presence, through the creak of an old pew, the soft hiss of candlelight, the hush that falls when the world outside is sleeping and something holy stirs inside stone walls. It was on such a night, deep in December, that I chose to stay behind in St. Aveline's. The wind outside rattled the stained glass windows, and snow tapped faint rhythms against the arched panes like a prayer in code. I had brought no blanket, only my coat, a flask of tea, and my notebook. Father Lucian had given me his blessing with a solemn nod. "You're welcome to stay," he said, "but be aware, the church does not sleep lightly." He had meant it kindly. Still, his words lingered as I pulled the heavy doors shut behind me and made my way toward the altar. The nave was bathed in flickering gold. Dozens of votive candles trembled on the side tables. I lit one myself, my hands shaking slightly, and sat in the fourth pew from the front, the one with the smooth dip in the center where countless parishioners had knelt before. Hours passed. At first, I listened for him, the gatekeeper. But instead, I heard other things. The settling of old wood, the occasional gust of wind that found its way through ancient cracks, the tiny click of wax dripping onto metal, and then a sound that was not the church. It began with a creak, a long, deliberate one, not from the pews, from the gate. I froze. The iron hinges of the outer gate, long rusted, groaned open. A hush followed, too deep for coincidence. Then came the footsteps, soft, rhythmic, measured, leather soles, perhaps, brushing the cold stone path that led up to the church. I turned my head slowly, heart thudding beneath layers of wool. Through the narrow windows, I saw nothing, but I felt it, a presence. I rose, leaving my things behind, and stepped quietly down the aisle. The main doors loomed ahead, etched with centuries of prayer and weather. I placed my hand against the wood, cold, breathing deeply. I pulled them open. Snowflakes danced in the air like falling ash. The path beyond was empty. Only the candles behind me offered light. But as I looked down, just beyond the threshold, I saw it, one wet footprint, just one, melting into the old stone. I whispered, "Hello." No answer. I stepped outside. The gate stood ajar. No wind this time, no hands visible, and yet it swayed slightly, like someone had just passed through. I didn't chase it. I only stood there, breathing in the stillness, letting the cold wrap around me like a cloak. Then I heard it, a sigh, faint and low, like someone catching breath after a long walk. It came from behind me. I turned. Inside the church, all the candles had gone still. Not one flickered. Later that week, a man came to the church, a pilgrim from Italy. His name was Matteo, and he had traveled with his wife across 3 countries in search of healing. Not physical, he told us, but something deeper. She's been ill in spirit. He said, holding her hand, "We've tried everything." They spent the night at the guest house. The next morning, he returned alone to speak with Father Lucian and me. His wife had risen before dawn, full of light. Her eyes, he said, had changed. She told me, he whispered, that she saw a man at the gate, an old man with a lantern. He said no words, he only bowed, but she said she felt healed, as if peace entered her. Father Lucian exchanged a glance with me. We both knew. Later, I pressed the priest gently. Has anyone ever known who he was? He looked toward the choir loft, where sun now spilled through colored glass. There is a story, he said slowly, from long ago, and he told me of 1912. The church was smaller then. No electricity, just candles, wood stoves, and hymns carried by breath. One winter night, a group of altar boys had been sleeping in the sacristy during a storm. A fire had broken out. No one knew how. The church keeper had fled. Panic reigned. But an old sacristan named Brother Henri ran into the flames. He dragged out 3 boys before the roof collapsed. His body was never found, only a part of his cloak. Since then, people whispered of a guardian, someone who stayed behind. His picture, I asked. Father Lucian led me down into the archives, a room of dust and forgotten names. After nearly an hour, he pulled a folder from the back of a shelf. There, among brittle documents and faded ink, was a photograph. It was him, the same gentle eyes, the same faint smile, the same cloak, though blackened at the hem. My breath caught. I didn't speak. There are moments in life that do not need explanation. They are felt, not understood, and in that moment, I no longer wondered whether the gatekeeper was real. He had always been here, not as ghost, not as memory, but as prayer. A prayer that walks, a prayer that waits, a prayer that carries a lantern through the darkest of nights. And I had seen him walk among us. Chapter 5. The Light That Stays. It took me longer than I expected to write the article, not because I didn't know what to say, but because the words felt heavy, like relics unearthed from sacred soil. I wasn't writing a ghost story. I was recounting something real, something witnessed, and in a strange way, I felt protective of it. But eventually, I did write it. The title came to me easily, The Nameless Gatekeeper. I submitted it to a small Catholic newsletter based in Lyon, a modest publication with thoughtful readers and a reputation for spiritual sincerity. I didn't expect much. 3 days later, my inbox was full. Messages came in from Italy, Ireland, even as far as Canada. People wrote to say they had seen someone like him, not in St. Avelines, necessarily, but in their own hometowns, near churches, on pilgrimage roads, in moments of quiet crisis. A woman in Avignon described a cloaked figure who stood silently outside her church during her father's funeral and vanished before the Mass ended. A young man in Poland claimed a stranger lit a candle beside him in an empty cathedral. then gestured toward the confessional, where the man would experience his first reconciliation in 10 years. Most stories ended the same way. The person turned to thank him, and he was gone. Some called him an angel, others, a saint in disguise. One elderly man simply called him the peace that walks. I printed every message, binding them carefully in a leather folder, each page humming with wonder and something else, recognition. Still, none of that compared to what happened next. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I had the dream. Or perhaps I should say, it was more than a dream. I was walking along the path toward St. Aveline's, just as I had so many times before. Snow fell gently, but I felt no cold. The gate was closed for once, but the iron shimmered as if breathing. And then he was there, the old man, standing on the other side. His lantern cast no shadow, yet the light reached me. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't point. He simply looked into my eyes and said, with a voice I somehow remembered, "Don't be afraid. The church is never empty." I woke up with tears already sliding down my cheeks. The clock read 2:47 a.m. Without thinking, I threw on my coat and ran. Through the guest house corridor, past the garden gate, down the snowy slope toward the church. My breath came in clouds, my heart pounding louder than the wind. And there, at the gate, he was. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not as a shadow, not as a story, but as someone standing fully in the world. His cloak was deep gray, trimmed with worn edges. His beard was silver, neatly kept. His lantern was brighter than any flame I had ever seen, but soft, like dawn before sunrise. It lit the ground around him, and strangely, the snow didn't seem to fall through it. He looked at me, he smiled, and I wept, not out of fear, not even joy, but reverence. His presence held something eternal, something that had been waiting long before I arrived and would linger long after I was gone. I wanted to speak, to ask questions, to thank him, but I couldn't move. He gave me the smallest nod. Then, like mist dissolving under morning sun, he vanished, not walked away, vanished. The light lingered for just a second longer, then faded. I stood at the gate for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I walked back inside. I didn't write anything that night. I didn't light a candle. I simply sat in the pew, letting the silence settle around me like a blessing. The next morning, I found a child sitting in the same spot. He was drawing something with colored pencils. His mother knelt nearby, whispering prayers. I glanced down at the page. A gate, a man, a lantern. He looked up and smiled. I saw him. He said, I smiled back. So did I. Chapter 6. Sacred Watchman. I left St. Aveline's on the 40th day. It wasn't planned that way, 40 days. Like the length of Lent, like a desert season of the soul, but when I looked back on it, it felt exactly right, a pilgrimage disguised as journalism, a journey that began with questions and ended with reverence. The train pulled away just after dawn. Frost glazed the windows, and the rooftops of the village blurred into white as the fields opened out before me. But even as the landscape changed, I felt him, still there, at the gate, watching, not with eyes, but with presence. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. Some things never leave. Within weeks of my return to Madrid, the story I had written, revised, expanded, prayed over, was picked up by a major Catholic journal. They titled it as I had, The Nameless Gatekeeper. They printed it in English, Spanish, and Italian. The responses were overwhelming. Parishes from across Europe began to send in letters, not just stories of sightings, but drawings, poems, candles lit in vigil. A pastor in Germany shared that someone had left a lantern at their chapel's gate. With no explanation, a nun in Brazil wrote of a similar figure she'd seen while praying for discernment in her vocation. And yet, something remained unique to St. Aveline's. Only there did the light continue. Each night, even long after my departure, locals reported the same soft flicker just beyond the gate. The church doors remained locked overnight. The grounds empty, yet the glow persisted. Some nights faint, others steady, never blinding, always warm. A young sacristan told Father Lucian that he once saw the light from inside the sanctuary during a late-night vigil. He swore he saw a silhouette standing by the gate, though no one else had arrived. I opened the doors, he said, but no one was there. And yet, the scent of beeswax lingered, and I felt like I'd just been blessed. Stories like these became quiet liturgies. People began to pray at the gate, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, sometimes they brought lanterns of their own, not to replace his light, but to honor it. A kind of communion, without words. A month after my article was published, Father Lucian installed a small brass plaque beside the entrance, just to the right of the wrought iron arch. Its message was simple, engraved with care, in memory of the unknown guardian who never left. He sent me a photo. I wept when I saw it. 2 years passed. Life moved forward, as life does. I wrote more, traveled, laughed, grieved. The world spun its stories. But the one from St. Aveline's stayed with me, like a psalm I could never forget. And then, in early autumn, I returned. The trees were gold in rust, the wind gentle. The hill leading to the church felt both familiar and new. The guest house had changed ownership, but the room I had stayed in still held the same wooden desk by the window. I left my bags there and went immediately down the path. The church stood waiting. The gate was still open, and beside it, nestled among ivy and moss, burned a single lantern, the same kind, brass, slightly dented, the glass fogged with age. But the flame was alive. Someone had trimmed the wick. Someone had replaced the oil. I looked around, but saw no one. Only the trees, only the hush. I didn't go any further. I stood there for a long time, hand resting lightly on the gate, and I whispered, "Thank you." I didn't expect a reply, but in the wind, the flame danced, and I knew he was still there. Not every sacred presence wears a name. Not every guardian speaks, but some lights never go out, and some watchmen never leave their post. He was not a story, not a symbol, not even a mystery to be solved. He was faith, clothed in silence. And that night, the gate glowed softly, as if it had always been waiting. I no longer try to explain him. Some truths, I've learned, are not meant to be dissected. They are meant to be reverenced. He was never the center of doctrine. never a miracle proclaimed by the Vatican, never canonized or officially named. Yet still, he lives in the soft margins of faith, the quiet spaces where incense lingers long after Mass, where old stone remembers the warmth of candlelight, and where lanterns flicker under the hush of stars. In the years since I returned from St. Aveline's, I've been asked many times to tell his story. Each time, I find myself hesitating, not out of doubt, but out of awe. How do you speak of someone who never spoke, and yet said so much? He didn't preach. He didn't perform signs. He simply appeared when needed and disappeared just the same. But the moment he came near, the world shifted slightly. Silence deepened. The air felt fuller. The ordinary became cloaked in something sacramental. Some would call that imagination. Others call it faith. I call it memory. There are still nights when I light a candle by my window and wait. Not because I expect him to come, but because I want to remember how it felt when he did. That warmth, that calm, that reminder that holiness isn't always loud or shining or wrapped in thunder. Sometimes, holiness wears a cloak, carries a lantern, and guards the quiet doors of a forgotten chapel. I've met many guardians since then. They are not all old, not all male, not all cloaked in mystery. Some bring food to those in need. Some pray alone at midnight. Some sit beside strangers without asking questions. Some light a single candle in an empty pew and leave before it burns out. We call them many things: angels, saints, friends, echoes of Christ. But I think they all belong to the same quiet order. Those who do not abandon sacred places. Those who wait, even when no one is looking. Perhaps he was never meant to be known. Perhaps he was never meant to leave. In every soul he guided. A light stayed burning, guardian of the church gate. Your watch is not over yet. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 2. And that is the full story I wanted to share with you tonight. A quiet tale, but one that lingers, doesn't it? Sometimes I wonder, what if something like this happened to me? What if I too passed by a church one evening and found someone waiting at the gate? Just thinking about it gives me chills. How about you? Have you ever experienced something that made you pause and wonder? If you have thoughts or feelings about this story, I'd love to hear them. Please share your reflections in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more quiet mysteries like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There's always another story waiting, just beyond the next gate. For now, I wish you a peaceful evening. May you sleep well, and may the quiet light stay with you. Thank you for listening. This is Fogman Stories.